Deborah Green. She was the kind of woman who made people feel small in the best possible way. A physician, an oncologist, a mother of three. In the well-manicured streets of Prairie Village, Kansas, she drove a red sports car and wore the confidence of a woman who had earned everything she had. People admired her, they respected her, and they had absolutely no idea what she was quietly becoming behind the closed windows of that 6-bedroom Tudor-style home on Canterbury Court. What does it take to destroy the very life you built? Not in a moment of madness, but over weeks, methodically, patiently, with the kind of precision that only a trained medical mind could sustain. That is the question that haunts the story of Deborah Green, a woman whose descent from admired professional to convicted killer was so gradual, so chillingly deliberate, that even those closest to her failed to see where it was all heading until it was far, far too late. Deborah Green was born on February 28, 1951, and by any measure, she had built a remarkable life. She met cardiologist Michael Farrar in 1977, while both were training at the University of Kansas Medical Center. The two married in 1979, and for years they represented something aspirational, a power couple in the Kansas City medical world, affluent, educated, with 3 children, Timothy, Kelly, and Kate. But marriages can carry fractures that take years to surface, and by the mid-90s, theirs had cracked beyond repair. Farrar filed for divorce in the summer of 1995, and that decision would prove to be the event that set everything else in motion. What Farrar could not have known was that his wife had already begun to act. Between August and September of that year, he fell violently ill, not once, but multiple times, each episode severe enough to require hospitalization. Doctors were baffled. Tests produced no clear answers. While he lay in hospital beds struggling to recover, the woman who had cooked his meals remained at home with their children, and in her purse, investigators would later discover castor beans, the raw source of ricin, one of the most potent natural toxins known to science. Green, as an oncologist, knew exactly what ricin was, and she knew exactly what it could do. She had even purchased a second batch in September of 1995 from a garden store in North Kansas City, telling the store manager the beans were for one of her children's science fair projects. None of her children had any such project. As autumn deepened, so did Deborah Green's unraveling. She began drinking heavily, some nights to the point of complete unconsciousness while her children were still in the home. On one occasion, Timothy and Kate called their father home from work because they could not wake their mother. She had reportedly hidden in the basement. Farrar eventually moved out in early October, fearing for his own safety. Then came the night of October 23, 1995. Farrar had taken 2 of the children to a hockey game that evening and returned them home at around 8:45. Hours later, in the earliest minutes of October 24th, a neighbor called him at his apartment, frantic. His house was on fire. Timothy was 13 years old. Kelly was 6. Neither of them made it out. Kate, 10 at the time, managed to climb from a bedroom window onto the garage roof and jump to safety. Green herself escaped. When investigators arrived, neighbors described her demeanor as remarkably composed for a woman who had just fled a burning building while 2 of her children were inside it. Arson investigators from the Eastern Kansas Multi-Agency Task Force did not take long to reach their conclusions. Their report, issued on November 10th of 1995, confirmed that the fire had multiple points of origin. Flammable liquid had been distributed across both the main and second floors. This was not an accident. This was not faulty wiring. This was the work of human hands. Deborah Green was arrested in November of that year. Remarkably, investigators found her at a theater in Kansas City, where she had brought her surviving daughter, Kate, to rehearse for a production of The Nutcracker. Kate had been given the lead role of Clara. Her younger sister, Kelly, had she lived, was to have played an angel. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive. Prosecutors threatened to seek the death penalty. Green ultimately entered no contest pleas to 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Timothy and Kelly, 1 count of attempted capital murder related to the fire, and 1 count of aggravated arson. She also acknowledged attempting to poison Farrar. In court, she spoke of psychiatric illness and what she called communication failures within the family. In 1996, she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 40 years, meaning her earliest possible release date would not come until she is well into her 80s. True crime author Ann Rule covered the case in a New York Times bestseller titled Bitter Harvest, which was later adapted into a Lifetime film. As of the time of this writing, Deborah Green remains incarcerated at the Topeka Correctional Facility in Kansas. Her multiple efforts to challenge and overturn her convictions have all been denied. The children she bore, raised, and drove to after-school activities are buried, and the question her case leaves behind, how does a healer become this, is one that medicine, law, and human nature have never fully agreed on an answer to. Christina Riggs, not every person who does something irreversible is a stranger to the world. Some of them are the people who take your blood pressure, who check your charts, who explain your diagnosis in language you can understand and sent you home with careful instructions. Christina Riggs was a licensed practical nurse in Sherwood, Arkansas. She wore scrubs to work. She drew blood. She monitored heart rates. She was the kind of person hospitals depend on. Quiet, trained, present in the way that keeps a ward functioning. And on the night of November 4th, 1997, she came home from a shift, put her 2 children to bed, and used what she had learned in that profession to end their lives. What makes this case resist easy categorization is not the act itself, but what came after it. Because Christina Riggs did not try to escape what she had done. She did not construct a lie. She did not vanish. She lay down beside her children and tried to die with them. That she failed is the only reason the state of Arkansas eventually had someone to prosecute. And when a jury convicted her, she stood up in open court and told them exactly what she wanted, to be executed so she could be with Justin and Shelby again. Christina Marie Riggs was born on September 2, 1971, in Oklahoma. Her early life carried damage that would compound quietly over the years. Childhood sexual abuse, a pattern of unstable relationships, a first pregnancy at 16 that ended in adoption. By her early 20s, she was working as a nurse and raising a son, Justin Dalton Thomas, whose father, Timothy Thompson, had been stationed at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma and walked away when she told him she was expecting. She later reconnected with a man named John Riggs, whom she married in July of 1993. Their wedding night ended in a miscarriage. Their daughter, Shelby Alexis, was born in December of 1994. In 1995, the family relocated to Sherwood, Arkansas to be near Christina's mother. Then the marriage ended too. John Riggs struck Justin hard enough in the stomach to require medical attention, and Christina filed for divorce and became a single mother of 2, working double shifts while childcare costs climbed. By the autumn of 1997, she was in debt, exhausted, and receiving irregular child support payments from 2 different absent fathers. Court documents would later describe a woman who felt she had run out of road. Prosecutors would argue something else, that she had grown to resent her children as obstacles to a life she believed she deserved. What the record shows, in her own words and in the suicide note she left behind, is that she saw no way forward for any of them and decided she would take all 3 of them out of the world together. She used her professional knowledge to plan what she believed would be a quiet and painless exit. She was wrong about the planning. She was wrong about the exit. And she survived while her children did not. Justin was 5 years old. Shelby was 2. Christina had obtained the antidepressant Elavil from a local pharmacy and took potassium chloride and morphine from the hospital where she worked. She mixed Elavil into water and gave it to both children to make them drowsy. When they were asleep, she injected Justin with undiluted potassium chloride. Because she had not diluted it properly, it did not work as she intended. Instead, it caused him to wake in acute pain. She injected morphine to ease it, held him, and when the pain passed, she smothered him. She then smothered Shelby, having witnessed what the injection had done to Justin and choosing not to use it on her daughter. She laid them together on the bed, covered them, and left a note on the nightstand for John Riggs. "I hope one day you will forgive me," it read in part. She then swallowed 28 Elavil tablets and injected herself with potassium chloride. The drug burned a hole in her arm rather than reaching her vein. 19 hours later, her mother arrived at the house when Christina failed to appear for work and found the children dead and her daughter on the floor, still alive. Christina Riggs was arrested on November 6, 1997. She gave a detailed recorded confession to police without hesitation. At her trial in June of 1998, her defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, citing severe depression and the psychological toll of her work treating victims of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Prosecutors countered that she had planned the act over 2 to 3 weeks, had left the children alone on multiple nights while she attended karaoke competitions, and that the evidence pointed not to psychosis, but to resentment. The Pulaski County jury convicted her on both counts. Then came the sentencing phase, and the moment that set this case apart from nearly any other in Arkansas legal history. Christina Riggs dismissed her attorney's efforts to present mitigating evidence. She stood and addressed the jury directly. "I want to die," she told them. "I want to be with my babies. I want you to give me the death penalty." The jury obliged. She was the only woman on Arkansas death row. She waived every appeal. She blocked her attorney from filing for clemency with Governor Mike Huckabee. She was transferred from the McPherson unit to the Cummins unit on April 30th, 200, in preparation for her execution. On the evening of May 2nd, 200, she was taken to the execution chamber. Her final words before the injection began were, "No words can express just how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies." A minute later, she whispered, "I love you, my babies." She was pronounced dead at 9:28 in the evening. Christina Riggs was 28 years old. She was the 5th woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, and the first woman executed in Arkansas since 1845. Whether she was a mother broken beyond repair, or a woman who chose her children's deaths and then dressed it in the language of love, is a question the legal record answered one way, and the human record has never fully resolved. Brookie Lee West. What drives a daughter to become her mother's keeper in the most sinister way imaginable? The answer lies in a storage unit in Las Vegas, where silence kept a terrible secret for 3 long years. The scorching Nevada sun beat down on Canyon Gate Mini Storage on that February afternoon in 2001 when manager Bill Unruh noticed something unusual. An overwhelming odor had been growing stronger near Unit 317, and when he finally opened the door, what he discovered would shake the Las Vegas community to its core. Inside a sealed garbage can, wrapped carefully in layers of cellophane and duct tape, lay the liquefied remains of 62-year-old Christine Smith. She had been missing since 1998, and the person who rented that storage unit shared her last name. Brookie Lee West was born on June 28, 1953, into a family where darkness lived as comfortably as light. Her father, Leroy Smith, worked as a police officer, but his badge represented only one side of his identity. Behind closed doors, he introduced young Brookie to practices most children never encounter, teachings rooted in occult beliefs and philosophies that would shape her understanding of the world in troubling ways. Her mother, Christine, struggled with her own challenges, including relationships outside her marriage that created fractures in an already unstable home. Growing up in this environment, Brookie developed a complicated relationship with both parents, particularly her mother. The family dynamics were anything but ordinary. When Christine's affair with a married man ended in heartbreak, the emotional fallout affected everyone in the household. Young Brookie watched her mother navigate disappointment and pain, all while trying to make sense of her own place in this chaotic family structure. As Brookie entered adulthood, the shadows from her childhood seemed to follow. In 1993, her brother Travis Smith disappeared without explanation. Though his body was never found, questions arose years later when someone checked into Santa Clara Valley Medical Center using his Social Security number, with the bill being sent to an address where Brookie had lived. The mystery of Travis's whereabouts would become one of several unsettling questions surrounding Brookie's life. During this same period, Brookie married Howard St. John. Their union ended tragically in 1994 when Howard passed away from injuries sustained in an incident involving a firearm. The circumstances raised eyebrows among investigators, though Brookie was never charged in connection with his passing. Another person close to Brookie had vanished from her life under questionable circumstances. By the late 1990s, Brookie was living in Las Vegas, sharing an apartment with her aging mother, Christine. Friends and neighbors who knew them described their relationship as volatile and unpredictable. Some days, the two women appeared devoted to each other, sharing meals and conversations like any mother and daughter might. Other days, tension crackled between them so intensely that witnesses felt uncomfortable in their presence. What outsiders didn't fully understand was the complex web of dependency, resentment, and financial strain that bound them together. Christine, now in her 60s, faced her own struggles with substance use, particularly involving beverages that clouded her judgment and worsened her health. The burden of caring for her mother weighed heavily on Brookie, who simultaneously managed her own financial pressures. Christine received monthly Social Security payments of about $1,000, money that became increasingly important as their circumstances grew more difficult. Then, in February of 1998, Christine Smith simply disappeared. When neighbors asked about the elderly woman they hadn't seen in weeks, Brookie had a ready explanation. She told them her mother had moved to Texas to live with her brother, Travis. The story seemed plausible enough that no one questioned it initially. Life in the apartment complex continued, and Brookie remained, seemingly managing on her own. What no one knew was that Christine had never left Las Vegas. While Brookie went about her daily life, making ATM withdrawals from her mother's bank account and maintaining the appearance of normalcy, Christine's body remained sealed in that garbage can in Storage Unit 317, which Brookie and Christine had rented together in June of 1998. 3 years passed before Bill Unruh made his grim discovery. When detectives began investigating, they found Brookie's fingerprint on the cellophane wrap that sealed the container. Inside, Christine's remains were so severely decomposed that determining an exact cause of passing proved impossible. However, medical examiners noted significant details. A white plastic bag covered Christine's nose and mouth, tied in a knot behind her head. The positioning and tightness of this bag raised serious questions about how Christine had ended up in that container. Dr. Neil Haskell, a forensic entomologist from St. Joseph's College, provided crucial testimony. He explained that the absence of certain insects typically found on remains, combined with the presence of others that indicated the body had been sealed quickly, suggested Christine had either been placed in the container immediately after she stopped breathing, or possibly even before. This scientific evidence contradicted Brookie's claim that her mother had passed away from natural causes and that she had panicked and hidden the body. The trial began in July of 2001. Prosecutors presented their case methodically, building their argument not on a specific cause of passing, but on the totality of circumstances. They highlighted Brookie's financial motive, pointing to Brookie's continued use of her mother's Social Security benefits. They emphasized the deliberate concealment of the body and the plastic bag covering Christine's face. They questioned why someone who truly believed their loved one had passed naturally would go to such lengths to hide the remains. Brookie maintained her innocence, insisting through her attorneys that Christine had indeed passed from natural causes and that fear had driven her actions afterward. But after deliberating for approximately 2 hours, the jury reached their verdict. On July 19, 2001, they convicted Brookie Lee West of first-degree offense in her mother's passing. District Judge Joseph Bonaventure sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Prosecutor Frank Kumu described the case as among the most unusual he had ever handled, characterizing Brookie's actions as representing profound darkness in human nature. Today, Brookie Lee West remains incarcerated at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Nevada, her life sentence ensuring she will never walk free again. The case of Brookie Lee West serves as a haunting reminder of how family bonds can twist into something unrecognizable, how financial desperation can corrupt judgment, and how secrets, no matter how carefully sealed, eventually find their way into the light.
Rachel Henry. Some people announce themselves to the world with noise, with drama and warning signs that others look back on and say, "We should have known." And then there are those who are terrifyingly ordinary right up to the moment they are not. Rachel Henry was 22 years old and living in a house near 24th Street and Vineyard Road in Phoenix, Arizona, raising 3 children who depended on her entirely. She was young. She was a mother. She was, by every outward appearance, just a woman navigating a difficult chapter of early adulthood. And then, one January afternoon, she sat down in a living room with her children and made a series of choices that would end 3 lives before sundown. The question that hollows you out when you sit with this case is not the legal one, it is the human one. What goes through a person's mind in the space between normal and that? January 20th, 2020 began the way most winter days do in Phoenix. Mild, ordinary, unremarkable. Zane Henry was 3 years old. His sister Mariah was 23 months, still at the age where toddlers mispronounce words and carry stuffed animals everywhere. Baby Catalaya Rios was just 7 months old, barely past the stage of learning to smile on purpose. All 3 children shared the same mother. All 3 were in the house that afternoon. When police body camera footage captured Henry speaking to officers that night, she was emotional. She told them she had put the children down for a nap, that she had not checked on them, and that she believed they were simply sleeping. Her voice cracked. Her eyes were wet. She spoke like a woman who had lost something, not a woman who had made a choice. But then the detectives sat down with her alone, and the story changed. Henry admitted to officers that she had taken the lives of all 3 of her children that afternoon, one after another, beginning with Mariah. She held her hand over the toddler's mouth as they were playing together and kept it there. Zane, her 3-year-old son, witnessed what was happening to his little sister. He yelled at his mother to stop. He struck her with his small hands, in the only way a 3-year-old boy knows how to fight. He did everything a child that age could do to protect his sibling. And for a moment, it seemed he may have succeeded. The children's father and great-aunt arrived home, interrupting Henry before she could reach him. The boy was still alive. But the adults left again. Henry took Zane to a bedroom. She sang him a lullaby, and as the song ended, so did he.
She then fed 7-month-old Catalaya a bottle, held the baby while she fell asleep, and ended her life as well. When it was over, she arranged all 3 children on the living room couch in positions meant to suggest rest. 3 small bodies, posed to look peaceful. Then she waited. It was the children's great-aunt, Perla Rebolledo, who made the 911 call. Her voice on the recording carries the kind of weight that words were not built to hold. First responders arrived to a scene so distressing that 5 years later, many of them were still attending therapy. Prosecutor Christopher Sammons told the court at sentencing that the case had affected not only the family, but every professional who had encountered it: law enforcement, court staff, first responders alike. After Henry's arrest, a relative arranged a video call with her and asked her directly why it had happened. Her answer was not a confession of motive or a declaration of intent. She said she felt like she was losing her mind. She said she did not understand why everyone around her was acting the way they were. Whether that statement represents the edge of a genuine psychological break or something else entirely is a question that was never fully answered in court. Henry entered a not guilty plea in 2020. For nearly 5 years, her trial was delayed multiple times, pushing the reckoning further and further down the calendar while the children's family waited. Then, in December of 2024, she appeared before Maricopa County Superior Court during a status conference and changed her plea to guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from the table. Her defense team noted contributing factors, including postpartum depression, an alcohol disorder, and a profound lack of support at the time of the incident. They acknowledged that even she could not fully account for what she had done. On February 14, 2025, Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Fish sentenced Rachel Henry to 3 consecutive terms of natural life in prison, 1 for Zane, 1 for Mariah, 1 for Catalaya. No possibility of parole. Henry did not speak when given the chance.
She stood before the court in an orange jumpsuit and remained silent as the judge addressed each child's death as a separate and distinct loss that deserved its own sentence. She was 27 years old the day she received those sentences. She will not leave prison. Zane, Mariah, and Catalia will not have the chance to grow into anyone at all. That is the complete and irreducible truth of what Rachel Henry did on a January afternoon in Phoenix. 3 children went down for a nap. Only their mother woke up.
Susan Smith. There is a story that nearly every parent in America knows, not because they read about it in a textbook, but because somewhere in the back of the mind, in the dark hour before sleep, it planted itself and never quite left. A young mother, 2 small boys, a lake, and 9 days during which an entire nation sat in front of their televisions, folded their hands, and prayed for children who were already gone. The story of Susan Smith is not just a true crime case, it is a wound in the American conscience, one that reopened 30 years later when a woman in a prison jumpsuit appeared by video link before a parole board and asked to be set free. Susan Smith was born on September 26, 1971, and grew up in Union, South Carolina, a small, tight-knit textile town where people knew each other by name and by family. Her childhood was fractured early by her parents' divorce, and her father's death by suicide when she was just 6 years old left marks on her that her adult life would struggle to contain. She married David Smith in March of 1991. By the following year, Michael was born. Alex followed in August of 1993. From the outside, the Smiths looked like a young family finding their footing, but the marriage was already buckling under the weight of infidelity, distance, and unresolved grief. By 1994, they were separated and moving toward divorce. What happened next is where the story takes its irreversible turn. In the weeks before October of 1994, Susan had been in a relationship with Tom Findley, the son of a wealthy local mill owner. Findley ended the relationship that month with a letter, and inside that letter was a single line that prosecutors would later describe as a catalyst for everything that followed. He told her he was not ready for the responsibility of another man's children. He did not want to be a stepfather. On the night of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith drove to the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, a quiet stretch of water about 9 miles outside Union. Michael was 3 years old. Alex was 14 months. Both boys were secured in their car seats in the back. What happened at that ramp, in the dark, with no witnesses, is something only Susan Smith can fully describe. She has said she intended to take her own life that night alongside her sons. What is documented is that she released the handbrake, stepped out of the vehicle, and watched her car roll forward into the lake with her children still inside. Then she drove away.
For the next 9 days, Susan Smith stood before television cameras in Union and gave a performance that held the country. She wept. She pleaded. She described a black man who had forced his way into her car at a red light, held a gun to her side, and driven off with her children still inside. The nation responded with the full weight of its grief and its outrage. Michael and Alex's faces were broadcast across every major network. Vigils were held. Thousands of families across America prayed for 2 boys they had never met. And all the while, those boys were at the bottom of John D. Long Lake, still in their car seats. It was Union County Sheriff Howard Wells who finally broke through. On the 9th day, he sat across from Susan Smith and told her, quietly, that her story did not add up. The traffic light where she claimed the carjacking occurred would only have been red if another car was present, and she had said there were no other vehicles. Carjackers, as a rule, want cars, not passengers. Why would any carjacker leave a grown woman behind, but take 2 sleeping toddlers? When the logic of the lie gave way, Susan Smith confessed. The car was located. The recovery of the vehicle from the lake, with the 2 small boys still buckled inside, became one of the most searing images in American television history. Investigators also noted what else was in the car: Smith's wedding dress, a photo album, and other mementos of her former life. One prosecutor would later describe it as though she had tried to submerge everything she wanted to leave behind.
Her trial in July of 1995 was a collision of two competing portraits. The prosecution described a woman who had devised a deliberate lie, one that drew on racial prejudice and national fear to buy herself time, in the service of a calculated choice to end her children's lives and pursue a romantic future. The defense presented a woman shaped by childhood loss, documented depression, and a mental state that had come apart under unbearable pressure. The jury convicted her on 2 counts of murder. They chose not to impose the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison. 30 years later, on November 20th, 2024, Susan Smith appeared by video link before the South Carolina Board of Paroles and Pardons for her first parole hearing. She wept again. She said the words a parole board needs to hear, that she was sorry, that she understood what she had done, that God had forgiven her. 15 people testified against her release, including David Smith, who stood before the board with photographs of Michael and Alex pinned to his jacket. The board voted unanimously to deny parole. She is now eligible again in November of 2026. Michael was 3. Alex was 14 months. They have been at the bottom of a lake and then in a cemetery in Union County for longer than Susan Smith's youngest son ever lived.
Diane Downs. When a mother arrives in an emergency room with 3 children who have been harmed, the natural human response is compassion and immediate assistance. But what happens when that same mother shows no tears, complains about her ruined vacation plans, and worries more about bloodstains on her new car than the condition of her own offspring? That unsettling disconnect was exactly what medical staff encountered on the night of May 19, 1983, in Springfield, Oregon, when Diane Downs walked through their doors with a story that would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, into what appeared from the outside to be a strict conservative family. Her parents, Willadine and Wesley Lyndon Fredrickson, maintained rigid rules about clothing and makeup, which made young Diane the subject of frequent teasing from her peers. Behind this facade of propriety, however, darkness allegedly lived. Diane would later claim that her father had inappropriate contact with her beginning at age 12, allegations that would paint a complex picture of her formative years. Whether these claims were true or part of a pattern of manipulation that would define her adult life remained a matter of debate among those who studied her case. After graduating from Moon Valley High School, where she met Stephen Downs, Diane briefly attended Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in Orange, California. Her time there lasted only 1 year before the institution expelled her for promiscuous behavior, a pattern that would continue throughout her life. On November 13, 1973, 18-year-old Diane ran away from home and married Stephen, who had enlisted in the United States Navy. Years later, she would admit that she married him not out of affection, but simply to escape her family situation. The marriage produced 3 children. Christy Ann arrived in 1974, followed by Cheryl Lynn in 1976. When their 3rd child, Danny, was born in 1979, Stephen began to suspect the boy wasn't his biological son. His suspicions proved correct. The marriage, already strained by financial arguments and Diane's multiple affairs, officially ended in divorce in 1980. By this time, Diane had established a troubling pattern of neglect toward her children. Stephen would later describe how she treated them poorly, forbidding them simple pleasures and rejecting their requests for attention. In one particularly heartbreaking account, he recalled finding young Cheryl asking if there was access to a firearm in the house because she wanted to end her own life, believing she was fundamentally bad because her mother had told her so. Following her divorce, Diane worked various jobs and even attempted to become a surrogate mother in 1981, successfully delivering a baby for $10,000 despite having failed psychological evaluations twice due to signs indicating psychosis. During this period, she began working for the United States Postal Service in Arizona, where she met Robert Knickerbocker, a married man who would become the center of her universe and ultimately the motive for unspeakable acts. Diane fell completely under the spell of this relationship, bombarding Robert with letters and begging him to leave his wife. But Robert made his position crystal clear. He did not want to be a father to anyone's children, and he certainly didn't want the responsibility of raising someone else's offspring. When Robert ended their affair and reconciled with his wife, Diane made a decision that she believed would solve her problem. In April 1983, she packed up her 3 children and moved to Springfield, Oregon, taking a job as a postal worker. She hoped desperately that Robert would follow her north, but he never did. The letters she continued to send him came back unopened, returned without being read. Her obsession only deepened with each rejection, filling the pages of her personal diary with fantasies of a life with Robert that conspicuously excluded her children. On May 19, 1983, Diane drove her 3 children along Old Mohawk Road outside Springfield. What happened next would be revealed through careful investigation and, eventually, through the testimony of a brave little girl who survived to tell the truth. According to the story Diane told authorities, a bushy-haired stranger flagged her down on this dark country road, demanded her vehicle, and when she refused, opened fire on her sleeping children before turning the weapon on her. She claimed to have faked throwing her keys to distract him, then rushed her wounded children to Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. Medical personnel immediately noticed inconsistencies in her account and her behavior. Dr. Stephen Wilhite, who treated the children that night, would never forget his interaction with Diane. She shed not a single tear. Instead, she complained about her vacation being ruined and expressed concern about blood damaging her new car's interior. Within 30 minutes of speaking with her, he knew something was profoundly wrong. Her wound was superficial, a gunshot to her left forearm that appeared to be self-inflicted, especially considering she was right-handed. If someone had truly attacked her family, why would the assailant leave the adult witness alive while ensuring the children were gravely wounded? The medical staff worked frantically on the children. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn was pronounced deceased at the scene. 3-year-old Danny sustained injuries that left him paralyzed from the waist down. 8-year-old Christy suffered a stroke that initially impaired her ability to speak. But Christy would ultimately find her voice, and when she did, she would identify the person who had truly harmed them that night. Investigators began piecing together the real story. Witnesses reported seeing Diane's vehicle traveling at approximately 5 to 7 miles per hour toward the hospital, contradicting her claim of racing there at high speed. It appeared she had been driving slowly, perhaps hoping her children would not survive the journey. Searches of her apartment uncovered her diaries filled with desperate entries about Robert Knickerbocker and her willingness to do anything to win his devotion. Both her ex-husband Stephen and Robert himself confirmed to authorities that Diane owned a .22 caliber handgun, the same type used in the attack, though she denied this to investigators. Unfired cartridges found in her home bore extractor markings matching those from the weapon used that terrible night. When Christy recovered enough to communicate, she initially wrote down the name of the person who had harmed her on a piece of paper, then immediately threw it into a fire. Eventually, with the help of a therapist, she revealed what she had written: "My mom." The testimony of this courageous child, combined with physical evidence and Diane's own bizarre behavior, sealed the case. On February 28, 1984, 9 months after the events on Old Mohawk Road, authorities arrested Diane Downs. In a twist that shocked even seasoned investigators, she was pregnant again during her trial, having deliberately seduced a man she met along her postal route in what prosecutors believed was an attempt to gain sympathy from the jury. On June 17, 1984, a jury convicted her on all charges, and she received a sentence of life in prison plus 50 years. The judge made clear his intention that she should never walk free again. Diane Downs remains incarcerated to this day, having been repeatedly denied parole. Psychiatrists who evaluated her diagnosed narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders, with one expert describing her as a deviant sociopath who views her children not as human beings deserving of protection, but as objects and possessions whose value extends only to how they serve her needs. Christy and Danny, adopted by the prosecutor Fred Hugie and his wife, built new lives far from the shadow of their mother's crimes. The case stands as a reminder of how obsession can corrupt maternal instinct into something monstrous, and how one woman's twisted pursuit of romantic fulfillment led her to betray the most fundamental bond that exists in human society. Teresa Knorr. Most people who do terrible things leave behind some kind of warning, a pattern others can point to later. a reputation that preceded them. But Teresa Knorr raised 6 children in Sacramento, California, and for years the only people who truly knew what was happening inside her home were the children themselves, and they had been taught, through fear and through pain and through the systematic destruction of their own sense of reality, that no one outside those walls would ever believe them. In the end, it took a phone call to a television hotline and a young woman's refusal to be dismissed one more time for the truth to surface. By then, 2 of those children had already been gone for nearly a decade. Teresa Jimmy Francine Cross was born on March 14, 1946 in Sacramento. Her childhood was shadowed by her father's Parkinson's disease diagnosis in the late 1950s, which left him depressed and, by several accounts, volatile toward his family. She dropped out of high school after her mother's death and married her first boyfriend, Clifford Clyde Sanders, shortly after. That marriage ended when she shot and killed Sanders in 1964. She claimed self-defense. She was acquitted. She was 18 years old. How a person processes that, the taking of a life, the acquittal, the absence of any real reckoning, is something no psychological profile has fully answered. What the record shows is that she simply moved on. She remarried. She had children. She kept moving forward, carrying whatever it was she was carrying. From her second marriage to Robert K. Knorr Sr., she had 4 children. Combined with 2 children from her first marriage, she was the mother of 6: Howard, Sheila, Suzanne, William, Robert Jr., and Terry. The family moved through Sacramento area neighborhoods over the years, eventually settling in an apartment the neighbors would later describe as perpetually dark and foul-smelling. Teresa pulled the children from school. She forbade them from having friends. She controlled what they ate, how they moved, and what they were permitted to say. The boys were not spared, but her 2 older daughters, Sheila and Suzanne, bore the weight of a particular consuming rage that escalated as the years passed. By the early 1980s, Teresa had become convinced that Suzanne had placed some kind of curse on her, that her daughter's presence was the reason she had gained weight. It was a delusion rooted in nothing but the architecture of a deeply disturbed mind. But inside that apartment, her word was absolute. She began force-feeding Suzanne enormous quantities of food, while simultaneously accusing her of being the source of every misfortune in the household. She had already shot Suzanne before, in the back, inside their own home. The bullet remained lodged in Suzanne's body for months, untreated, because Teresa forbade any outside medical attention. When she eventually decided to remove it herself, she did so with a craft knife. At no point did anyone outside those walls intervene. In the summer of 1984, Teresa instructed her sons, William and Robert Jr., to take their seriously ill sister, Suzanne, out to a remote area near Auburn, California, and leave her there. Suzanne was 17 years old. Her remains were discovered by a passing motorist on July 17, 1984, and logged as an unidentified Jane Doe. She would remain unidentified for 9 years. Sheila met her end differently. By 1985, Teresa had locked her inside a closet in the family's home and withheld food and water until Sheila, who had also been shot by her mother previously, could no longer sustain herself. She was 20 years old. Her body was disposed of in Placer County and was likewise recorded as an unidentified Jane Doe. After Sheila's death, the family moved, then moved again. The surviving children, old enough now to understand what had happened, young enough to have been shaped entirely by the terror of it, scattered as soon as each one was able. William found a girlfriend and settled in Woodland, California. Robert Jr. eventually ended up in Las Vegas, where he was arrested in November of 1991 after shooting a bartender during a robbery. Teresa herself relocated to Salt Lake City, using her maiden name. The youngest daughter, Terry, escaped using her deceased sister Sheila's identification documents to pass herself off as a legal adult. Terry tried to report what had happened to authorities in Utah. They dismissed her. She tried a therapist. The therapist did not believe her either. Then, on October 28, 1993, she called the tip line for the television program America's Most Wanted. That call changed everything. Placer County detectives reopened both Jane Doe cases and, with Terry's information, confirmed that the 2 unidentified women recovered from the mountains were in fact Suzanne and Sheila Knorr. Arrest warrants were issued in November of 1993.
Teresa was apprehended in Salt Lake City on November 10, 1993, with bags already packed and $4,000 withdrawn from her bank account. She had been preparing to run again. She was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 special circumstances charges covering multiple murder and murder by torture. After learning that both William and Robert Jr. had agreed to testify against her, she changed her plea to guilty to remove the death penalty from consideration. On October 17, 1995, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Teresa Knorr, the daughter whose persistence brought the case to light, passed away from heart failure on December 8, 2011. She was 41 years old. Teresa Knorr remains at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She became eligible for parole consideration in 2027.
Marie Noe. Sympathy can sometimes be the perfect disguise. When a community rallies around a grieving parent, offering casseroles and condolences, questioning that grief feels almost sacrilegious. But what happens when tragedy strikes the same household not once, not twice, but 10 times over 2 decades? At what point does sorrow become suspicion? For Marie Noe of Philadelphia, that question wouldn't be answered for 30 years. And by then, the tiny graves that lined Northwood Cemetery told a story far darker than anyone had imagined during those long years of communal mourning. Marie Liddy was born on August 23, 1928, in Philadelphia's working-class Kensington neighborhood. Her early years were marked by struggle and hardship. At age 5, she contracted scarlet fever, an illness she would later cite as the cause of learning difficulties that plagued her throughout childhood. These challenges led her to drop out of school as a young teenager, taking jobs to contribute to her struggling family. At age 12, when one of her older sisters gave birth, Marie helped raise the baby, who was essentially brought up as her own sibling rather than her niece. This early exposure to childcare would take on a haunting significance decades later. At a private club in West Kensington, Marie met Arthur Allen Noe, a machinist who would become her husband. After a brief courtship, the couple eloped on June 1, 1948. Arthur was 7 years her senior, a hard-working man who earned over $200 a week and served as a ward committeeman in North Philadelphia. He later worked for the Philadelphia Gas Works in the city of Philadelphia. By all outward appearances, they seemed like any other young couple starting their lives together in post-war America, settling into a modest row house in their Kensington neighborhood. In March of 1949, their first child, Richard Allen, arrived healthy and developing normally. Marie and Arthur welcomed him with the joy typical of new parents, decorating a nursery and sharing photos with neighbors. Then on April 7th, exactly 31 days after his birth, Richard stopped breathing. Marie found him in his crib, lifeless. Doctors could offer no explanation. The couple buried their son and grieved, believing they had simply experienced the kind of terrible tragedy that sometimes befalls young families. But the pattern had only just begun. In September of 1950, Elizabeth Mary was born, another healthy baby girl. She lived 5 months before she too passed away unexpectedly in February of 1951. The Noes grieved again, this time with mounting questions from relatives and friends. How could this happen twice? Medical professionals of the era had limited understanding of why infants sometimes stopped breathing, often attributing such occurrences to unknown natural causes. Over the next 18 years, 8 more children would be born into the Noe household. Jacqueline, Arthur Jr., Constance, Catherine Ellen, Mary Lee, and Teresa each entered the world seemingly healthy. Most died within weeks or months. Catherine Ellen managed to survive 14 months before she too was found lifeless. Only Letitia, who was stillborn in 1959, and Teresa, who lived 6 hours after complications during birth in 1963, were deemed to have passed from clear natural causes. The other 8 children all shared a chilling similarity. Each was found alone with Marie, each had been developing normally, and each stopped breathing without medical explanation. During this period, Philadelphia and the nation grappled with a newly recognized phenomenon. In 1969, medical experts formally defined sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS offered an explanation for the unexplainable, a diagnosis for cases where seemingly healthy babies passed away in their sleep without warning. The Noe children's passings were retroactively attributed to this syndrome. The couple became, in the words of one publication, the most bereaved parents in America.
Media attention followed. Life magazine published a sympathetic profile in July of 1963, using pseudonyms to protect the family's privacy while exploring their unimaginable string of losses. Newsweek covered their story as well. The community rallied around Marie and Arthur, viewing them as victims of cruel fate. Arthur remained steadfastly devoted to his wife, never wavering in his support. He had been at work during each of the passings, coming home to find Marie distraught and another child gone. He helped teach her to read, manage their finances, and stood by her through grief after grief. But not everyone accepted the SIDS explanation. Dr. Joseph Spellman, Philadelphia's chief medical examiner, harbored doubts as early as the 1960s. Other medical professionals whispered concerns. The statistical improbability of SIDS claiming so many children in one family seemed to defy logic. Even Dr. Molly DePina, the city's pathologist who performed autopsies on several of the Noe children and who initially championed SIDS research, privately admitted to investigators that this case troubled her. Yet without concrete evidence, and in an era when the medical community was just beginning to understand child maltreatment, no formal charges were ever filed. The case might have remained closed forever if not for investigative journalist Stephen Fried. In 1997 and early 1998, while researching for Philadelphia Magazine, Fried revisited the Noe story. Surprisingly, Marie spoke with him openly, saying she wanted to know the truth about what happened to her babies. She described their passings as one of them stupid things that happens, adding, "We just weren't meant to have children, I guess." These interviews formed the basis of his explosive article, Cradle to Grave, published in April 1998. The same day the magazine hit newsstands, police brought 70-year-old Marie Noe in for questioning. After 11 hours of interrogation, she finally broke. She confessed to using a pillow to suffocate at least 4 of her children. When pressed about the others, she claimed she couldn't remember what happened to them, but acknowledged she was probably responsible. Before leaving the interrogation room, she whispered to investigators, "Don't tell my husband what I told yous." In August 1998, prosecutors charged Marie Noe with 8 counts of first-degree offenses. Her defense attorneys argued that her confession had been obtained under duress, but the evidence was overwhelming. In June 1999, she pleaded guilty to 8 counts of second-degree charges. The plea agreement resulted in an unusually lenient sentence, 20 years of probation with the first 5 years under house arrest, conditional upon her participation in psychiatric studies aimed at understanding why mothers harm their offspring. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Marie suffered from mixed personality disorder. Experts theorized various motivations, though none could fully explain why she had repeatedly ended the lives of her own children over nearly 2 decades. Some suggested Munchausen syndrome by proxy, others pointed to deep psychological trauma from her own childhood. Arthur Noe, who had defended his wife throughout the ordeal, never wavered in his support. He passed away in December 2009 at age 88. Marie lived on probation until her passing on May 5, 2016, 3 months before what would have been her 88th birthday. She had lived 48 years after the passing of her 10th and final child, 5-month-old Arthur Joseph. The house on American Street where so much tragedy had unfolded was sold in 2013. The Marie Noe case stands as one of the worst instances of maternal harm in recorded history, a reminder that evil can wear the face of grief, and that sympathy, while a natural human response, must sometimes give way to difficult questions and uncomfortable truths. Brandy Worley. There are crimes that the human mind keeps trying to find a frame for, a reason, a context, a crack in the story that explains the inexplicable. And then, there are crimes so stark in their logic that the frame is the most disturbing part. Brandy Worley did not snap. She did not come undone in a single chaotic moment. She cooked dinner. She watched her children play. She sat in a living room in Darlington, Indiana, while her husband put Tyler and Charlie to bed. She waited. And then, in the early hours of November 17, 2016, she made a series of deliberate choices that ended 2 lives and revealed a motive so cold in its simplicity that a courtroom full of seasoned legal professionals fell silent when they heard it spoken aloud. Darlington is a small town in Montgomery County, Indiana, the kind of place where people raise families and go to school events and know their neighbors by name. Jason and Brandy Worley had built a life there over 7 years of marriage. Jason was a software engineer. They had 2 children, Tyler, 7 years old, a first grader his father would later describe as the kind of boy who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 20 new friends. Charlie was 3, and she loved dressing up and having her hair braided. By all outward appearances, the Worleys were an unremarkable family, navigating ordinary life. But the marriage had been fracturing quietly. Jason had discovered that Brandy had been having an affair with a neighbor. The trust between them had collapsed, and on November 15, 2016, 2 days before the events that would end their family permanently, Jason told Brandy he wanted a divorce. What happened next reveals something about the way a certain kind of mind processes the threat of loss. Not grief, not desperation, a transaction. If Jason filed for divorce, he might be awarded custody of the children, and Brandy Worley, by her own account, could not allow that to happen. The solution she arrived at was not separation, or legal strategy, or the difficult work of co-parenting. It was the permanent removal of the children from any possible future she would not control. On the afternoon of November 16, 2016, the family went about a routine evening together. Jason came home from work. They attended Charlie's dance practice as a family. They had dinner at home. Later that evening, Brandy told Jason she needed to run to Walmart to pick up pipe cleaners for a school project Tyler was working on. She returned home and went quietly to Tyler's bedroom. She was not carrying pipe cleaners. She hid what she had purchased in the room, then came back out to the living room where she and Jason spent the rest of the evening playing with their children. The same 2 children she had already decided would not see morning. Jason put Tyler and Charlie to bed. He went downstairs and fell asleep. In the early hours of November 17th, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, Brandy Worley woke Tyler and invited him to have a sleepover in his little sister's room. He climbed out of bed and followed her down the hall, trusting her the way a 7-year-old boy trusts the person who has been the center of his world since birth. In Charlie's bedroom, what happened next took the lives of both children. When Charlie stirred at one point and asked her mother what she was doing, Brandy told her nothing. Charlie went back to sleep. Afterward, Brandy Worley called 911. Her voice on that recording is the detail that people who have heard it say they cannot unhear. Flat, measured, undisturbed. "I just stabbed myself and killed my 2 children," she told the dispatcher, the same way someone might read an item off a grocery list. The dispatcher, stunned, asked her to repeat it. She did. When he asked her why, her answer was precise. "My husband wanted a divorce and wanted to take my kids, and I don't want him to have my kids." Jason Worley was asleep downstairs when the call was made. He woke to a reality that no amount of anticipating the end of a marriage can ever prepare a person for. Brandy was treated at a hospital for self-inflicted injuries to her neck, wounds her own prosecutor noted were far less effective than those she had inflicted on her children. She was booked into Montgomery County Jail after more than a week of medical treatment. She initially entered a plea of not guilty, and her defense team indicated they might pursue an insanity argument, pointing to depression and a history of mental health struggles. But on January 20, 2018, she appeared in a Montgomery County courtroom and changed her plea to guilty on both counts of murder. At her sentencing on March 19, 2018, Brandy Worley stood before Montgomery County Superior Court Judge Peggy Lorhorn and said nothing. Her attorney, Mark Inman, told the court there was no explanation he could offer. He noted that prosecutors, in electing not to pursue the death penalty, had shown restraint that he publicly acknowledged. Jason Worley took the stand to describe his children to the court, not what had been done to them, but who they had been. Tyler, Charlie, the boy who made friends everywhere he went, the little girl with braided hair. "All I care is to never see her again," Jason told the court when asked what he wanted for his ex-wife's sentence. Judge Lorhorn sentenced Brandy Worley to 120 years in prison, 65 years for the first count and 55 for the second, to be served one after the other. She will not be eligible for release within any reasonable span of a human lifetime. Tyler was 7. Charlie was 3. They had a father who loved them, and a mother who decided that if she could not have them, no one would.
Pearl Cynthia Fernandez. Sometimes the people who should protect the innocent become the very architects of their destruction. In Palmdale, California, a small apartment on East Avenue Q10 became a chamber of unspeakable cruelty, where an 8-year-old boy's cries for help went unanswered by the very systems designed to save him. When first responders arrived on May 22, 2013, to find Gabriel Fernandez's lifeless body, they encountered a scene so disturbing that seasoned paramedics struggled to maintain their composure. But the real question that haunted investigators wasn't just what had happened to this child, but how his own mother could orchestrate 8 months of systematic torment that would ultimately end his young life. Pearl Cynthia Hernandez was born on August 29, 1983, into circumstances that would later be scrutinized for understanding how she could become capable of such acts. As an adult, Pearl faced her own struggles, including documented mental health challenges and difficulties maintaining stable relationships. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez came into the world on February 20, 2005, born to Pearl and Arnold Contreras. Shortly after his birth, recognizing her inability to care for the infant, Pearl made what seemed like a responsible decision. She placed Gabriel in the care of his great-uncle, Michael Lemus Carranza, and Carranza's partner, David Martinez. For the first years of Gabriel's life, he lived in a nurturing environment with his great-uncle and his partner. They provided stability, affection, and safety. Gabriel attended school, made friends, and developed into a bright, creative child who loved to draw and play. Those who knew him during this period described a happy boy with an infectious smile and gentle spirit. Then, when Gabriel was around 7 years old, Pearl made a decision that would seal his fate. She decided she wanted him back. In October 2012, Pearl regained custody of Gabriel and brought him to live with her in Palmdale, along with her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre. Aguirre, born on June 13, 1980, had entered Pearl's life and quickly established himself as a dominating presence in the household. Friends and neighbors of Gabriel's great-uncle and his partner expressed concern about the transfer of custody, but their worries were dismissed by social services, who saw a mother reclaiming her child as a positive development. What transpired over the next 8 months inside that Palmdale apartment represented a level of calculated cruelty that defied comprehension. From the moment Gabriel entered their home, Pearl and Isaro began subjecting him to treatment that progressively escalated from neglect to outright torture. Gabriel's siblings, who witnessed the ongoing mistreatment, would later testify about the systematic nature of the harm. The couple often laughed while inflicting their abuse, treating Gabriel's suffering as entertainment rather than recognizing the humanity of the child before them. The methods employed ranged from physical beatings to psychological torment. Gabriel endured impacts from belts, hangers, and golf clubs. He suffered burns from cigarettes and heated objects. Isaro used Gabriel as target practice with a BB gun, leaving pellets embedded in the child's skin. The couple forced him to consume cat litter, cat feces, spoiled food, and his own vomit when his body rejected these substances. They confined him to a small cabinet where he was forced to sleep while bound and gagged. According to prosecutors, one of Isaro's motivations stemmed from his belief that Gabriel might be developing non-traditional masculine behaviors, which Aguirre found unacceptable. Pearl did nothing to protect her son from her boyfriend's rage. Jennifer Garcia, Gabriel's first-grade teacher at Summerwind Elementary School, became the first mandated reporter to raise alarms. When Gabriel began asking her questions about being whipped and she noticed visible injuries, she immediately contacted the Child Welfare Hotline. Other calls followed from concerned teachers and school officials who watched Gabriel's condition deteriorate week by week. Each time, social workers from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services were notified. Each time they visited the home, spoke only with Pearl, and left without ever interviewing Gabriel himself or conducting medical assessments. On May 22, 2013, Pearl dialed 911, claiming Gabriel had stopped breathing after falling and hitting his head. When paramedics arrived, they found the 8-year-old boy lying naked on the floor, with injuries so extensive they immediately suspected foul play. Emergency responders transported Gabriel to Antelope Valley Hospital, where doctors declared him brain dead. He remained on life support for 2 days before being taken off at Children's Hospital Los Angeles on May 24, 2013. The autopsy report painted a portrait of prolonged suffering. Gabriel had sustained a cracked skull, broken ribs, bruising covering most of his body, and BB pellets lodged in various locations. Medical examiners concluded that his passing resulted directly from blunt force trauma, significantly aggravated by ongoing neglect and malnourishment. The evidence indicated this final beating had been inflicted allegedly because Gabriel had not cleaned up his toys to Pearl and Isauro's satisfaction. Authorities immediately arrested both Pearl and Isauro. Initially charged with felony child endangerment and attempted harm, the charges were upgraded to first-degree offense with special circumstances of torture once Gabriel passed away. The prosecution pursued maximum penalties for both defendants. In February 2018, facing a potential death sentence, Pearl accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to first-degree offense and admitted the special circumstance allegation involving torture. At her sentencing hearing, she offered a brief statement expressing regret, saying she wished Gabriel were alive and that she had made better choices. Judge George Lamelli sentenced Pearl Fernandez to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in June 2018. Isauro Aguirre proceeded to trial, where prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his participation in Gabriel's torture and demise. The jury convicted him of first-degree offense with special circumstances of torture, and Judge Lamelli sentenced him to death. Deputy District Attorney Jonathan Hatami, who prosecuted both cases, called the pair representations of pure evil and stated that their actions inflicted lasting damage not just on Gabriel's family, but on society itself. Pearl currently serves her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. In 2021, she petitioned for resentencing based on changes to California law, arguing she could no longer be convicted of first- or second-degree offense under new statutes. Judge Lamelli denied her petition, noting that she had admitted during her guilty plea that Gabriel's passing was intentional and involved months of torture. Isauro remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, awaiting automatic appeals. The Gabriel Fernandez case sparked nationwide outrage and led to reforms in California's child protective services. Netflix produced a documentary series examining the failures that allowed Gabriel's suffering to continue, despite multiple reports to authorities. His story serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when systems fail and when maternal instinct becomes perverted into something monstrous beyond imagination.